Somewhere far south in Indochina, in the equator region, amidst the tropical forest, lies a lost city of an ancient, highly developed civilization, Angkor Wat. Huge, majestic structures built by unknown, using unknown and impossible technologies, were hidden for centuries by impenetrable jungles from human eyes. And only in the middle of the century, a French researcher stumbled upon it completely by accident. And the world got the opportunity at last to marvel at the magnificence of megalithic structures, generously sprinkled with endless bas reliefs of unearthly beauty. That's what the average person thinks, or something like that, when they hear about Angkor Wat. Hollywood movies filmed among these ancient temples underline the aura of mystery and magic. And the enthusiastic bloggers filming the complex of these architectural masterpieces immerse the mind in a semi-sleepy dream of dreams about ancient, highly developed civilizations, snake people, and other tales. You don't want to crawl out of this sticky fog of fantasies. But still, you want to know even more who, when, and how built these magnificent structures. But do we really have a reliable opportunity to do this? After all, any records can be forged and changed, any stories can be made up, right? Information can be manipulated as desired, and we will never have a real opportunity to establish a date. And no matter how you look at it, in the end, we are left with nothing but to choose blindly whose story to believe or not. You are on the Epoch of Distrust channel with Mikhail Kalmykov, and now we will try to unravel this mystery with you. And there is something to think and argue about. In particular, Maxim Gaubitz, the author of the Forgotten Ruins channel, claims that this temple is thousands of years old or something like that. Another author, Yuri Abrin, insists that this entire complex was built in the middle of the 14th century. And Ekaterina Norkina, from the Laboratory of Alternative History, believes that there is nothing interesting in Angkor and no traces of ancient advanced civilizations. Who is right? Who to believe? Let's not believe anyone, especially the official history, since it has already discredited itself as a sold-out girl. Therefore, we simply ignore the main part of Yuri Abrin's arguments, which are based on the official history. We just ignore it. We ignore it. Let's pretend that we know nothing about history at all. We will rely solely on verifiable facts, only those that we can see with our own eyes. Touch, check. And sometimes we will compare them with the official history for a general understanding of where and what does not match. So let's go, history. It's no secret that people always try to settle closer to water, because first of all, you can't get anywhere without water. We need it for life almost as much as we need air every day. And secondly, bodies of water have always been a source of food. Fish, mollusks, crayfish, crabs, and other products. Being a fisherman is much easier than being a hunter. In addition, water bodies provide fairly quick and easy movement. So settling near them is natural, and the larger the water body, the more preferable it is. It's best to organize trade there. That's why all the richest cities and civilizations were born on the shores of seas and oceans, in the most convenient bays, or at the intersections of other water routes, for example, rivers. And the Khmer civilization in this respect is no different from any other. Naturally, the large cities and settlements of this people were located right there, on the shore of the Indian Ocean, in the Gulf of Siam. However, the sea and the ocean are not the only sources of water, so they actively settled along the banks of rivers and lakes. And it is quite natural that the civilization of the Khmers almost instantly spread along the full water river Mekong, as well as slightly less full water river Tonle Sap. And deep in the peninsula, in the place where these two rivers merge together, the capital of Cambodia, Phnom Penh, was founded. Naturally, human settlements went up these rivers, including the Tonle Sap River, all the way to the huge Tonle Sap Lake and even further into the mainland. This means that the Angkor complex, located just 16 kilometers straight from the shore of this huge lake, with its artificial Western Barai Lake of 15 square kilometers next to it, simply could not go unnoticed, especially considering that in addition to this lake, there are at least 6 more artificial reservoirs there. And that means they undoubtedly attracted animals, and consequently hunters followed them. And the main tower of this complex rises above the ground by several tens of meters. Calculations show that it should be visible from a distance of as much as 30 kilometers. Let's make an adjustment to the jungle, the horizon line, and all that stuff. But even in this case, climbing to the roof of his own hut, any fisherman could see this structure from many kilometers away. And in general, what are we talking about? 16 kilometers in a straight line is nothing at all. This perimeter is covered by any human settlement within a year. Well, let's say our Khmers will be particularly lazy, but even in this case, 10 years is more than enough to find this city and settle it properly. Then why is it believed that this city was abandoned as early as the 14th century? No, really, it's not even in the mountains. 16 kilometers is 3 hours of unhurried walking along a forest path or trail, and to trample a trail, or, God forbid, lay a road, is a piece of cake. Specialists from British Broadcasting Corporation and National Geographic channels believe that the city was abandoned due to a lack of drinking water. And such a thing is really possible, be it in a hard-to-reach place, in the mountains, somewhere in the Andes, but here 16 kilometers straight from a huge lake where a huge number of settlements are, moreover in the same Andes in the mountains. Around the same time, the Incas created the city of Cusco, also with megaliths. By the way, nothing exists to this day, and even squeezed out by the local population by the Spaniards, the conquistadors, or here is Rome and the Roman Empire. If there is no water, we build an aqueduct at any distance, and 16 kilometers away is not a limit. Only if the technology allowed, and, judging by the architecture of Angkor, the technology very much allowed. So why is it believed that this city was dead and even lost for 600 years? Maybe because it just wasn't there. The opening of Enigma, the reopening of Angkor, took place in the year 1860. The French traveler Henri Mouhot accidentally stumbled upon these ruins, which he sketched and published in a book. Actually, no, not like that. He himself fell ill with malaria very soon and literally almost did not die in the same year after the discovery, and the book was published posthumously. By itself, as I already said above, it's hard not to notice such a giant in the jungle. Therefore, firstly, Henri Mouhot himself mentions in his earlier books that this complex was visited by Europeans even before him, in particular Charles-Émile Beauveau. That is, Henri didn't stumble upon the complex by accident, he went there intentionally. Secondly, historians also beautifully absurdly write about the lostness of this temple, that in fact monks always lived there. But here it turns out one absurdity was replaced by another. The thing is that monks of any confession, be it Orthodoxy or Buddhism, are still people who are disciplined in the first place. That is, they have internal discipline, a hierarchy, which they strictly adhere to, and where there is discipline, there is order. I just can't imagine a bunch of monks who would have lived among the ruins for 40 years. And they absolutely wouldn't care that trees are growing on the walls, which are destroying the brickwork with their roots. The fact that the temple complex is essentially ruined, that there are rubble lying around here and there, that the dome is falling off, and that hordes of snakes live in the buildings. And the statues of the gods they are praying to right now are half broken, and sometimes even stand without heads. No, any normal person, let alone a monk, would instinctively keep their living space in order. He will remove the fallen stones, prop up those that are about to fall, throw out or fix, or finally eat the snakes, cut down the trees, at least those that grow directly on the building. But none of this was done in 4 centuries. This speaks to the complete indifference of these monks to living conditions. Maybe this is their faith achieving complete unity with nature? Let's take a look at other Buddhist temples. No, in other temples, it seems the faith is the same, the monks are the same, but there is order. So, it's a blatant deception. There were no monks there for 400 years. Again, why? Maybe because there was no temple, or there were no people. In any case, there is no definite answer. The place is fertile. Everything grows there. Rice, sugarcane, rubber, citrus, potatoes, cotton, fish, pigs, cattle, and so on. The geographical location is very convenient, but for some reason, the people are really poor. And this is with a population of only 17 million people. It's really surprising. Well, okay, but what about our French openers? And they behaved quite strangely again. 70 years later, in 1931, the International Colonial Exhibition was held in Paris. The French decided to recreate Angkor Wat in its natural size on a 5,000 square meter area for it. Well, to put it in words, the central temple of Angkor Wat just happens to take up that much space. For this, the architect's father and son Blanche were hired, and in just 6 years, they prepared and produced an exact copy of the temple. I'll note that this model in Paris was not built out of wooden planks, as many might think, but entirely out of plaster, sand, and cement, that is, essentially out of concrete. This is to the question of whether such a structure could not have been created by casting. Yes, it's complicated. In Paris, in the year 1930, that's exactly what they did. Actually, it was a very clear demonstration, but of what exactly? Possibilities or something else? Answering this question perhaps gives a different nuance. Specifically, the largest colonial power, Britain, did not appear at the exhibition of colonial states. Why? It's quite possible that the root of the conflict was precisely Angkor Wat, but more on that a bit later. Place of action. The entire complex is in ruins, and some bloggers are convinced that it was buried and is being excavated. And it's still being excavated to this day. But is this possible? After all, Henri Mouhot in the middle of the 19th century, as soon as he discovered this complex, immediately saw it in a beautiful state. Yes, and the architect's Blanche, before building a cement mullage in Paris, also went there and studied it in the original to copy it. But Maxim Galbitz from the Forgotten Ruins channel is sure that the complex was exactly buried, and it was exactly dug up, and he brings his video footage from still unexcavated places as evidence.
As for the question of whether Angkor was buried, was there a boy? He was there, friends, significant. One pyramid is buried, from which I'm going, another pyramid is buried. And this layer, it's not mounds cleared, cleaned, here the traces, this layer has not yet been removed, trees grow there, under it.
Something here doesn't add up. Let's figure it out. First of all, we need to come to an agreement with you on what exactly should be considered buried, what is dug up, and what is covered up. Indeed, the words seem to be the same, and it seems like we constantly point out to the viewers the fact of the existence of buried cities all over the planet. Buried, it's the same in Rostov, Taganrog, Peter, Moscow, Prague, Rome, well, everywhere. What exactly do I not like here? And here's what. First of all, I don't like the associations. When the phrase Angkor is pronounced, many people have an association with a building buried under the very floor along with the roof. But this is clearly not the case. At least because the Dome of Angkor rises above the plain by 65 meters. You just can't bury something like that. Nevertheless, in some frames presented by Maxim Gaubitz, it seems like you can actually see traces of the burial under the floor. How is that possible? One of my subscribers very accurately formulated the correct statement of the question. Specifically, if the functionality of the building is critically impaired due to the accumulation of clay, sand, or anything else, it can be considered a landslide. And by a landslide, I mean floors, but not the entire building. If the building is completely submerged in the ground up to the very top, then it is buried. Such things also happen right next door. That's what we'll be dancing from. Secondly, what bothers me is self-satisfaction. The thing is, the huge plain where the Angkor complex is located rises above sea level by only 14 meters. Moreover, Lake Tonle Sap, which is only 16 kilometers away from it, raises its level by up to 10 meters during the rainy season and spreads so wide that the distance from it to Angkor is reduced to 8 kilometers. Thus, if the temple complex is buried, the maximum depth cannot be more than 9 meters. But even this is just a concession. In fact, the water level in the Western Barai is at the 18-19 meter mark. Then there is an artificial dam on the sides with a height of 30 meters. In the Hardia RVE pool surrounding Angkor, the water level is also at the 19 meter mark above sea level, plus the banks rising another meter. This suggests that this is precisely the lower level. There are no burials below it. In any case, the construction of Angkor was based precisely on this level, as if it were the zero mark. Now let's take a look at one of the videos that Maxim presents as evidence of the burial. Look here. Maxim approaches the entrance to one of the temples, showing that first there are wooden steps going up, and then on the other side of the wall they go down. And on the camera you can see people coming up to meet them. They are very small, and therefore the whole picture gives an impression of great depth. However, let's not give in to emotions and look at the facts that we see right before our eyes. Fact 1, there are 6 steps leading up, and inside the temple there are 16 steps going down, which means the depth of immersion is 10 steps. Remember, now let's look at the planks from which they are assembled. The thickness of the plank is 2.5 centimeters, that is a classic inch. The width of the plank is slightly more than 10 centimeters, but less than 15, but we will count to the maximum. That is, the height of the step is equal to or less than the width of one plank. And this means that the total depth of the ladder's immersion is 15 multiplied by 10 1.5 meters, and this is the maximum, taking into account the full width of the planks, and it is not everywhere like this. However, Maxim says that the depth is a few meters, and looking at the people rising, yes, indeed, they are much lower than the upper platform of the stairs, and the whole focus is on the fact that at this moment our brain forgets that before we descend, we climbed up another 6 steps. As a result, it turns out that the height of the stairs is 2.5 meters, actually much higher than any person, and indeed a few meters, but at the same time the depth is only 1.5 meters. In another video, my colleague Max from the World on a Plate channel shows the fallen inside the gallery stone roof fragments, and among them sand with the words, "Look, everything was filled up to the very roof." And indeed, there is sand there. But first of all, if you press the stop frame, it is visible that out of the 3 gallery windows, only 2 are filled, and the third is filled a little more than half. And further on, the sunlight and free space can be seen. The stones lying on the ground are not covered at all. Of course, they are lying on the sand, but there is no sand in the crevices between them, not even in the narrowest ones. When cleaning such a fill, it's easier to remove all the stones than to clean the crevices between them. But then the question arises, what kind of selective fill is this? Such, in terms of scales and sizes, it looks more like a dump truck of sand that was decided to be dumped on this particular concrete wall for some reason. The first thing that comes to mind is a special hand fill by restorers. And indeed, in this video, it's visible that the unexcavated part is just a small pile about half a meter high, seemingly left in the passage and not removed. Why? So that tourists would stumble upon it and be convinced that everything was filled in. Removing such a pile is a matter of an hour at most, and one Khmer with a shovel. All right, let there be two Khmers with shovels. Notice that the sand remnants in the upper part of the gallery do not look like they have been lying there for hundreds of years. You can easily make such remnants at your cottage by yourself if you just throw sand up against the wall with a shovel. In this form, the sand will stick, but here even a pile of sand is clearly fresh, as if someone deliberately sprinkled it. However, let's not attribute everything to such a deliberate conspiracy, especially since such a selective sprinkling has another more natural explanation. But more on that a bit later.
On the question of Anchorage's sprinkling, was there a boy? He was there, friends. Significant. One pyramid is sprinkled, from which I am going, another pyramid is sprinkled. And this layer, it's not a mound cleaned here the footprints. This layer has not yet been removed. Trees grow under it.
If it had been dug up, there would have been a landslide on the sides first. Well, obviously, and secondly, the stone block chips would have been either partially or completely buried or cleaned and laid out in even layers, because no one is going to dig out small pieces of sand, clay, and dust from the smallest cracks between the moved blocks. Even the Khmer monks. Well, besides, trees don't grow under the ground, in any case, crowns. And the walls of the complex were covered in rampant vegetation, which again directly suggests that no one dug it up. It was just like that right away. And this means that we have a lower time limit for the construction of this complex, since we, with a high degree of probability, assume a complete burial of the planet with clay and sand. About 740 years ago, then Angkor Wat simply physically could not have been built earlier. More precisely, it could, of course, but then it would really be under the earth, since the whole planet is buried without exception. The thing is, they are dredging rivers in the same India, and the tops of temples are showing on the surface, even in the western beret of the same complex. When the water reservoir dries up, some previous structures of the Angkor walls, flooded with water and buried in clay and silt, are exposed. But that's in the pool, and Angkor itself has amazingly avoided this. We're talking about a real siltation depth of 10 to 20 or more meters. The 1.5 meter siltation of Angkor in this case speaks of a different siltation mechanism, having almost nothing in common with that global siltation. And a little later, I'll tell you how it could have happened. Buildings of a later time, but also with traces of impossible technologies. But at the same time, unburied ones are also found all over the world. A living example is the assembly of the Parisian Godmother. In principle, the technologies are exactly the same, and the material is surprisingly similar, but at the same time, it is not buried. In other words, Angkor could not have been built earlier than the 16th, 17th century without variations and exceptions. All arguments about the uniqueness of the location are shattered by Angkor itself and its buildings. At the bottom of Barai, they talk about how the truly ancient part of the city was buried to the very top. And what's above the ground is a new build using blocks from the old buried parts of the complex. By the way, the lakes of Western and Eastern Barai themselves resemble a huge archaeological excavation more than lakes. But we'll talk about this a bit later. Material. So the Parisian model was made of concrete, and no matter how you look at it, it's still stone, albeit artificial. And it has quite good strength depending on the brand. Therefore, we will further discuss with you about the materials and the overall picture of the temple's location. The very fact of making the Ankara model in Paris from a cement gypsum mixture already speaks of the existence of many ways and possibilities to create something similar. However, let's stick to reality. And it is such that the most advantageous method of construction is to work with the material that is at hand, within easy reach. Therefore, before we start arguing about what it's made of, quartzite, granite, sandstone, limestone, or diorite, let's look at the geology of the area. What about the locality? Let's open up the geology of all of Cambodia, so we know what lies where within 100 or even 200 kilometers radius. And here actually is the map of geological formations in Cambodia. As we can see, the entire valley of the river in Tonle Sap Lake lies on Cambrian late Silurian deposits. A little further west are basalt outcrops, and Angkor itself stands exactly on old alluvial rocks. That's what will be dancing from basalt. This, of course, is very strong, but to transport it to the temple complex, one has to overcome a water barrier, and not one, and no stone quarry has been found in that area. If you have other information, please share in the comments. I would be happy. Another type of material is the Cambrian late Silurian deposits. It is believed that they are quite strong, rich in metal impurities and even gold. These rocks include quartzite. It is one of the hardest rocks. Much harder than classic granite, which has a value of 6 or 6.5 on the Mohs scale. Sometimes it is written that granite reaches 7 units on the Mohs scale, but the whole focus is that any stone is a mixture of minerals, a kind of vinaigrette. Therefore, there is no clear division of what is exactly granite and what is quartz. The percentage of minerals, porosity, and the size of internal fractions determine everything. So quartzite is, in general, one of the types of granite in which the quartz content reaches 75%, which results in phenomenal hardness. But quartzite is hard to confuse with anything else because of its shine and layered structure. Among the Angkor blocks, there is nothing similar to them, more like basalt, so the main massive blocks should be either basalt or something else that we haven't found yet. Next, we have laterite. This is not even a type of stone, but a type of rock. As the reference book says, it is a surface formation rich in iron and aluminum, formed as a result of weathering of mountain rocks. Another name is non-carbonate red color. Thanks to its structure, it has a compressive strength comparable to modern good quality concrete. And thanks to its porous structure, it is almost twice as light as the same concrete or sandstone. The only downside is that it can't be used for carving because due to the same porous structure, it's impossible to achieve any drawing, let alone a bas relief. Nevertheless, it's perfect as a load-bearing part. And in any shots from Angkor, you can see that the builders did just that. The inner core of the walls and coverings is made of laterite. Only the outer part is covered with another material, with laterite. There was another problem. Next to Angkor, his birthplace is either non-existent or scarce, although his birthplace was still found, along with traces of his extraction. This is approximately 40-50 kilometers from Angkor, not far from the Beng Mielia Temple. But all the ornamentation, all the bas reliefs are applied to a completely different type of rock. Inside it has a yellowish tint and is characterized by a large number of coarse particles, literally sandy baking. In some places, this rock is covered with a black coating that suggests thoughts of a fire, and in some places the coating is greenish, which speaks of organic matter. Both sandstone and laterite belong to alluvial rocks. They have practically the same density, but there is one significant difference. In laterite, there are a lot of metal inclusions such as iron, aluminum, and therefore it is more durable than sandstone. But its porous structure does not allow it to be the basis for engraving reliefs. And sandstone has another difference. Over time, the outer part of the stone, its bark, becomes dense, glossy. It becomes very difficult to penetrate it. It literally armors the stone, and the impression is created that the whole stone is like that. However, this is a mistake. Inside, it's still the same soft and yielding sandstone. That's why it crumbles in this particular way. First, the outer dense baked crust falls off, and underneath it, a loose material is exposed. Angkor, as we remember, stands on old alluvial deposits. This alluvium is also a loose rock, but obtained through river deposits of sand and clay. Young alluvium. Usually it's loose, crumbly, and the old one is already compacted, and it has a yellowish tint and a loose structure of weathering. And it is on it that the Angkor complex stands. Crumbling, it leaves behind crushing parts, produces a full impression of a sandy furnace. Also, alluvium explains the characteristic black soot on many walls. Most likely, this is not the aftermath of a fire, as many might think, but the release of carbon remaining after the death of microorganisms of the MHA silt under solar radiation. And in both cases, during a fire and with desert soot, black particles remain because in both cases it is carbon. However, during a fire, there will inevitably be other features characteristic of high temperature influence, for example, melting, which is not present here. This is confirmed by the greenish tint of the stones in some places. These are mosses and the simplest microorganisms for which in a humid tropical environment, a substrate of dense sand and clay is the most nutritious environment. And the presence of huge trees right in the buildings among the masonry confirms this, as they have something to feed on. Even quarries for the extraction of alluvium are right under the nose. Here they are, these mysterious water basins, and the largest of them is the Western Barai. He explains both why they dug it up and where they put the breed. Moreover, they could extract both old alluvium and denser blocks from the same place. They simply brought them from older, silted-up walls, the remnants of which still exist at the bottom of the Barai. And even some moments in the processing and application of ornaments. However, things are not so simple here. The fact that the material on which most of the ornament is applied is soft sandstone can logically lead us to the idea of casting or embossing bracelets on an even softer structure. Quite possibly somewhere they did exactly that. For example, the mirror channel on the dish showed fragments of walls where the bas reliefs were clearly applied manually. That is, either embossed with some kind of stamp or someone from people cut out on an even softer structure. Hence the absence of ideal forms and proportions. Done haphazardly and awkwardly, like a lame chicken. However, to think that the entire Angkor was made using such technology would be a fatal mistake. Maxim Galbitz from the Forgotten Ruins channel discovered and showed something terrifying. Part of the wall, which for some reason was unfinished, thrown into the very heat of construction. It is clearly visible on it that the work was not done manually, but specifically by machine, with the use of some unknown technology today. Judge for yourself. The video shows that almost unprocessed stones were laid first, almost because the places where the stones touch each other are perfectly aligned. It's impossible to insert a knife, a leaf, or a needle into the gap between them. Sometimes you can't even see the gap itself. And this fact alone completely rules out the technology of casting in molds. It's impossible to cast a mold like this. Well, maybe once, at most twice, given a lot of time and the opportunity for trials and errors. But on such a scale, it's impossible. No throwouts, deep vibrators, no iron plastic forms will give such an exact match on all axes. However, the same effect can be achieved if you use something like a modern strobe cutter, only on an enlarged scale, although it will give roughness and voids. Perhaps, most of all, a sandblasting cutter or plasma one is suitable. We have all these now, so for now we will consider these methods the most suitable. In any case, we definitely know how to make perfectly even cuts of stone in a straight line. By the way, we recall the Parisian Angkor Wat made of cement gypsum mixture. There was definitely casting there, but just as definitely there was sharp cutting on the still raw composition. Nevertheless, in the Angkor, the machine processing of the stone is clearly visible. Traces of machines are visible, even the configuration of its stone-cutting surface. These are two rhomboid chisels. And we understand that before it suddenly stopped, the machine worked in the following way. Some installation about 1.5 meters high was submerged to the untreated part of the wall and bit into it to the necessary depth. Judging by the video frames, it's about 10 to 15 centimeters. It could have been deeper, but currently this is what we see. Then the machine went along the wall at an unknown speed to us and performed the following action. First, it removed the excess layer of stone. Second, it made the necessary indentations. Third, it drew a groove. And all this in one pass, that is, immediately. What kind of mechanism could this be? Let's try to figure it out. We can assume that a machine with cylindrical cutters was moving along the wall, immediately set in a pattern. That's what we do now. However, this theory is immediately dismissed, simply because if the cutters were cylindrical, then the cutting diameter of the cylinder would definitely be greater than the depth of the rock removal. And this means that, first of all, we would see a spiral-shaped response part of the cut, and this part. Secondly, there would be no diamond-shaped vertical bend of the cut. It's simply impossible to position a cylindrical cutter in such a shape. And thirdly, the pattern begins to appear immediately after the excess piece of the wall is removed. That is, immediately a maximum of 1 to 3 millimeters from the line of choice of the main breed was the second row of cutters, the one that made the patterns. And this means that if it was still a cylindrical cutter, then there was not one. There were very many of them, and they were very small in diameter and possibly had additional mobility. This somewhat suggests us to some program control, something like a computer numerical control, or even artificial intelligence. Besides, it's completely unclear where the extra waste stone went. Let's assume that during the work it was ground into dust by the cutters and now lies right here under our feet in the form of sand and dust. Of course, there is another option that the grooves were carved out of soft material, but I'm afraid that won't satisfy us either. And for the same reasons, due to the nature of the removal of the main mass of soil and the subsequent magnetic application of the pattern, no template, roller, or router can apply the patterns immediately after the milling machine or, say, a plow for soil removal. This requires some run-up space, and there isn't any. Perhaps the milling machines and drills were microscopic. Well, micro-milling machines and micro-drills. This, of course, is the standard explanation that would satisfy us, since we at least understand these methods, and possibly we could even create something similar now. But I'm afraid we don't have materials of sufficient strength from which we could make similar thin milling machines, which with a working body length clearly more than 15 centimeters and a diameter of a maximum of 5 millimeters, would not give a bend and would not violate the overall geometry at the same time. Maybe then a laser or plasma cutter could be quite possible. Such an option is much better for us, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine what power such a setup would require. Moreover, in these frames, you can see another interesting nuance. Specifically, despite the fact that this fantastic setup performed a huge number of operations in one pass, it still didn't perform all the necessary operations. If you look more closely, you can see that in these places, the groove is not yet complete, not final. It seems to be extruded or cut out in one plane of force application, directly from the working part to the wall in the horizontal plane. It's not really a groove yet, but a rooter, some kind of preparation, a base for the future groove. The same place where the leaves are cut out from the backside. where there are the thinnest stone bridges with a diameter of 1 millimeter, where cuts are made in all possible flatnesses. So it turns out this was just a rough processing, and after it, the final processing should have been done already with a different mechanism. In such a case, it becomes a little more understandable how those same bridges were created. If the final version was made with a more jewelry-like mechanism, with a changing geometry of the inclination of the working body, be it a laser, plasma, or something else. In this case, it was no longer necessary to remove megatons of rock, but simply to work on a pre-drilled template. Computer control of such a mechanism is not even discussed. Manually controlling such a process, after all, is simply impossible. Judging by the volume of stone selection that we observe, the preliminary dimensions of the installation were approximately 1.5, 2.5, 5 meters in height, and about 70 centimeters in width. The back part, facing the operator, was protected by a soundproof impenetrable shield on which, most likely, the control panel was located. Why such a sudden conclusion? Well, first of all, it's basic safety technique to ensure that flying debris doesn't harm the operator. Secondly, on the opposite end of this wall, where the machine started its work, there is a noticeable misalignment of the ornament lines along the vertical axis. Moreover, the misalignment is very significant. And this can tell us that, first of all, the work was done by a machine, most likely derived from ancient, more advanced civilizations. Secondly, the machine was operated by a person, and this person did not possess all the necessary skills to work with this machine. And when he was turning from one angle to another, he simply did not see where to place the working parts of the device. And this is the most obvious reason he just didn't see it. Something was obstructing his view. Most likely, it was the protective leather cover. So it turns out some people, ordinary, illiterate people, received tasks and tools from someone, but at the same time, they themselves had no understanding of how it works. This is not exceptional. It still occurs on construction sites. But there's one more nuance. The thing is, along the entire length of the stone selection, the line should be perfectly straight, and for this, the device must move parallel to the wall just as evenly. Otherwise, the slightest inaccurate hand movement will change the angle of force application and spoil the aim. In our time, to achieve this effect, for example, rails or something similar are used. The surface on which the machine moves should also be perfectly flat. Now, in that place is sandy soil ground. What was there then is unknown. We can fantasize or suggest some levitating platform, but I would still prefer not to stray far from reality, although such is possible. And here we approach the most dramatic moment. The thing is, we already know that all the ornament, all the stone selection by height in meter by meter 20 was done in one go, and in the place where the machine went to the corner, the ornament drawing completely went down immediately 10 centimeters, plus minus. But the lowest step didn't go anywhere. It stayed in the correct position. The settings were knocked off specifically in the upper part of the mechanism. And this, in turn, says at least that, firstly, the matrix cutting template was not rigid, as we have now. It had some number of segments, each of which required separate aiming and adjustment. Each such segment was independent of the neighbors and apparently was in some floating state. That is, the option with rigid drills and cutters is completely ruled out. And this is more like a laser or plasma cut, where each level responds with its own beam with its own settings. In addition, the cutting part was still at some distance from the wall, quite significant, which allowed several target blocks to fall down a bit. And the very bottom one stayed in its place. It had nowhere to fall. This nuance also underscores the further path that the machine has gone to a complete stop. It's clearly visible that the cutting part of the shuttle's lines ceased to be even, and closer to the very end, the drilling depth becomes less and less. So, the machine, along with the focus of the cutting beam, moved away. At the end of the ends, the machine stopped and no longer worked. Perhaps at that moment there was no operator. He disappeared somewhere, for example, ran away. But why? Catastrophe? The thing is, one of the most interesting questions in the Angkor complex is the nature of the destruction of temples, walls, and buildings. How did it happen that part of the wall is destroyed, but the ones standing next to it are not? Moreover, it's visible that, generally, all the structures suffered. But at the same time, some remain standing in their place, some even preserve the perfect alignment of blocks, and some are completely destroyed. And this is despite the fact that, despite the local small pieces of debris on the megaliths, the direct place of impact is not visible. Possibly to explain this, historians have come up with some ancient Khmer wars. But with the advent of the 20th century and the era of world wars with the massive use of artillery, it became clear that similar destruction of temples could not be achieved with any bows, arrows, or catapults. And here it is very convenient. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia began with the aim of overthrowing the evil dictator Pol Pot. I won't discuss the political side of this madness now, but in any case, this war played into the hands of historians, and now some of the destruction can be explained by artillery strikes. For example, a large part of the territory is restricted for visitation under the pretext that it is still not completely demined. Nevertheless, we now understand that artillery strikes also could not have caused such damage to the complex. There are no impact sites, craters. No, of course they can be, but even a 150-millimeter weapon cannot cause exactly such damage. That is, to make it so that the megalithic slabs from which the temple or wall is made simply scattered in different directions.
The blocks are not in their projected positions on the sides. Maxime, you love to talk, but not me. It's unclear why they completely lost this position every morning. That is, well, it should fall somehow, but I saw they fall, like walls. They fall. The whole row, the whole wall, which should definitely collapse, they were this tower.
Many bloggers directly repeat over and over that Angkor Wat is in Angkor at all. In particular, the unique polygonal masonry. It looks like masonry in Sacsayhuaman, Machu Picchu, Teotihuacan, and so on. But no, yes, the sharpness of the blocks there is really chic, and in places it really has different angles of inclination of the cut, for example, the tops of windows and passages. But this is not polygonal. There is just a very high-quality cut of stone blocks, and on the whole they are cut and laid like ordinary bricks. The main difference of polygonal masonry lies in the fact that the sharp protrusion of blocks occurs along all axes, both horizontally and vertically, and even diagonally. And it is made with one main purpose: to ensure the seismic stability of the building. In case of an earthquake, if the ground does not collapse under the building, then the building will automatically return to its original form. If the masonry is brick, that is, from blocks, then with any even minor disturbances, the blocks, no matter how massive and ideally matched they were, will gradually disintegrate. The chief architect of this complex was definitely very smart and educated, but still a man, moreover, with excellent knowledge in architecture and obviously necessary equipment. But his knowledge was insufficient to understand what he was building and why. The so-called Ankara polygon is located in places of redistribution of construction loads and performs the role of ordinary lintels, for example, over windows or doors. We still do it this way. Real polygonal is not about load redistribution, but about seismic resistance. The destruction of Angkor is seismic in nature, not impact. How did it happen that some buildings and walls were destroyed while others were not? What kind of strange earthquake is this? Let's figure out how a normal, familiar earthquake works. According to the official theory, in places where tectonic plates meet, tension builds up from the pressure of one plate on another, and eventually one of them cracks and sharply rises or falls. The tension is relieved, everything calms down, and so on until the next increase in tension. Such a seismic shock is very dangerous, but it spreads sharply and is accompanied either by a powerful uplift of the ground or, conversely, by large bottomless pits. Accordingly, the most seismically dangerous zones are located precisely at the junctions of these tectonic plates, and Cambodia is not located there. More precisely, it is located in the vicinity of tectonic faults on the Eurasian plate, which is squeezed by the Indo-Australian plate on one side and the Philippine plate on the other. And at the junction of these plates, indeed, a huge number of earthquakes occur almost every day. But Cambodia itself is located in the middle, in the calm part, so there are no classic earthquakes in our understanding there, and there never have been. Yes, indeed, geology confirms there are no faults, cracks in the Earth's crust, or suddenly appearing rocks there. Yes, there is a mountain range that actually shields the seismically active part of the plate. From the quiet and calm plain, rising from 10 to 30 meters above sea level, where the Angkor complex is located. No significant earthquakes occur there and have not occurred. All the most serious tremors occur daily at a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers from Angkor. Only weak echoes reach it. They are hardly capable of destroying the megalithic temple. So, the earthquake was unusual. It was not caused by the classic pressure of one plate on another. Let's take another look at the nature of the temple complex destruction. A distinctive feature is the complete or substantial destruction of one building and almost intactness of the neighboring one. How could this have happened? There's only one way. Have you ever wondered why, when struck, for example, with a hammer on glass, it does not disintegrate into dust, but shatters into more or less large pieces? And the further from the epicenter of the strike, the larger the pieces. And it's all very simple. When a hammer hits glass or any other solid object, it first resists and bends, absorbing all the energy that was enclosed in the strike. A powerful wave is formed, which radiates radially from the epicenter of the strike. In those places where the wave reaches its peak, cracks appear. Over time, this wave fades, the amplitude increases, the wave lengthens, and accordingly, the size of the fragments increases. In addition, the wave can interfere with itself, creating the most unexpected crack patterns. But the overall picture will still remain unchanged. In general, everywhere in the universe, where any waves are activated, they behave approximately the same. There are peaks of activity everywhere, where the energy of the wave is maximum, and there are places where the wave activity is zero. Waves love to interfere with each other, creating zones of silence and zones of explosive resonance. For example, lightning, also a wave, only electrical. There are known cases when in a large group of people, being in one connection, for example, alpinists, every second person was killed by a lightning strike, and those who were between them did not even feel the strike. This is also a property of the wave. Thus, if during the construction of Angkor there was some external impact on the Earth's lithosphere somewhere not far from it, then the spreading seismic waves simply had to create such zones where everything would be destroyed, and neighboring ones where everything would remain untouched, which in fact we observe in Angkor. In such a case, for precise dating of the construction of this temple complex, we just need to find somewhere not far from it some epic explosion. For example, an eruption of a supervolcano or the place of an asteroid impact, which, as we know from previous videos, is essentially the same thing, and you don't have to go far. Just to the south is the island of Sumatra and Indonesia in general, where there are quite a few supervolcanoes. Dates of eruptions and emissions, some of which are know, for example, the Toba supervolcano. Scientists say that it erupted 75,000 years ago, and its explosion was so horrific that it affected the entire planet, including the climate. But 75,000 years is somehow far away. And although I prefer not to trust official datings, let's leave it as it is for now. We'll search more. And here's another one. This is the Krakatau volcano. It's located right next to Toba, and its eruption was in the year 1883. Also a strong one. As a result of its explosion, an entire island was destroyed. Besides, it caused a huge tsunami. As a result of this disaster, in addition to the island itself, 165 cities were completely destroyed, and another 32 cities received serious damage. At least 36,000 people died. The consequences of this disaster were felt across the planet. Could such a disaster, apart from a tsunami wave, cause exactly the same tsunami, but in the Earth's lithosphere? Yes, indeed. Not only could it have, but it did. It simply had to do this. So we have one candidate for the date. It's May 20th, 1883. But these are just the tip of the iceberg once more. Not far from there is another supervolcano, Tambora, just a couple of tens of kilometers from our traveler's beloved fairy tale Bali. And by a mysterious coincidence, it also erupted, but a little earlier, in April of 1815. Its explosion was simply colossal. Even the eruption of the Krakatoa volcano was a light breeze in comparison. Compared to it, by the most approximate estimates, no less than 70,000 people perished. The entire culture of the inhabitants of Sumbawa Island was destroyed, and the Tambora language died out. This disaster affected the entire planet, and scientists are even inclined to blame it for the notorious 3 years without summer in Europe. This is exactly what fits the role of the culprit for the destruction of Angkor. The pools and canals, many researchers, including myself, are disturbed by the gigantic man-made Barai pools around the Angkor complex. 2 huge rectangular lakes with sides approximately 8 by 2 kilometers. They are connected by a branched network of canals to each other and other smaller man-made lakes. It was believed that water was supplied to them through a canal dug from the Siem Reap River to the East Barai, and then it was distributed to the rest. This raises the question, where actually did all the excavated soil go? The question is not as simple as it seems. Look, any traveler riding a moped around these man-made lakes will instantly tell you that all the soil is simply spread out around the sides of these basins in the form of a dam. Look at how huge it is. And indeed, the width of the dam is on average plus or minus 100 meters. The height of these dams on the side parts of the perimeter reaches up to 12 meters, and on the frontal parts up to 7 meters. Well then, let's calculate. The side parts have a length of about 2 kilometers, while the frontal parts are about 8 kilometers long. By rough calculations, we get an average dam height of 8 meters. Knowing the dam's perimeter, its height, and a width of about 100 meters, taking into account the correction for its semi-oval shape, we get a total volume of soil slightly less than 30 million cubic meters. And the volume of soil extracted from the reservoir itself amounts to 80 million cubic meters. Where did the remaining 67 million cubic meters go? In East Barai, the situation is similar. About 46 million cubic meters were extracted from it, and approximately 8.5 million cubic meters went to the dam. Where are the other 38 million cubic meters? And in North Barai, the situation is exactly the same. About 4 million cubic meters are lost. And if you take into account the soil from all the remaining canals and ponds, the figure can be boldly increased by at least another 30 to 40 million cubic meters. Minimum. In total, we have no less than 140 to 40 million cubic meters of disappeared soil. Where did he go? How to find him? Turns out it's very simple. Since we are on a plain, and that means there should be classic landslides, terracons, and they are there. For example, not far from the quarry, where they mined laterite, rises a solitary mountain with the Hindu temple Bante Shray. According to the most superficial calculations, it contains about 5 million cubic meters of dumps. Another similar mountain with a temple on top, Phnom Krom. By the way, it is practically on the shore of Tonle Sap Lake. And it's very strange that none of our travelers were drawn there. I wonder why. Nevertheless, this mountain contains no less than 30 million cubic meters of rock. The third hill is just 2 kilometers from the eastern Baraya, apparently so as not to transport the rock too far. It's called Nam Bak, and there's also a temple or clock tower on top of it. In general, the volume of this terracone is no less than 107 million cubic meters. In total, we count 107 plus 30 plus 5. 142 million cubic meters of waste rock lie right in front of the nose, and we just happen to lose 140 million. Plus minus exactly. In other words, during the construction of these lakes, a large amount of unnecessary soil was left over, which was stored not far away. In the end, the reservoirs were dug out, canals were led to them, and the water supply system worked, providing the complex and all the surroundings with water. However, something happened, and the Siem Reap River, which fed the pools, dried up. Why did this happen? Some kind of drought or what? This river still exists, but it has turned more into a large stream, and its power is not enough to fill all the reservoirs. Most specialists and historians prefer to stop at this point and reconcile with the inevitable. Well, it dried up and dried up. And now I'll explain why they try not to delve into this topic. As we all know from school, water is a liquid, and if it is in 2 communicating vessels, its level will be the same. Therefore, if you dig 2 huge pools connected by a network of canals, the water level in them will be the same. For the water to flow freely from one to the other, a drop of a few centimeters is enough. It can even be without a drop. The only question is how much water pressure you need. It's impossible to imagine that the builders of the Angkor complex didn't know this. So at this moment, that is right now, the level of the eastern Barai is 10 meters higher than the level of the western Barai, while the calculated depth of filling in both Barais is no more than 5 meters. With such a ratio, the eastern Barai will never be filled with water. Even if it rains all year round and the Siem Reap River turns into the Nile, all the water will instantly drain into the western Barai and then flood the surrounding fields and buildings. And this means that we have another but deadly explanation of what happened. The tectonic plate on which all of Cambodia is located has completely risen at an angle of about 300 degrees. And it happened very quickly. If we assume for a second that the builders of Angkor were good architects and initially made the pools horizontally level, then the current tilt of the remaining water in the western Barai will definitely point us to the place that is to blame for this disaster. And this is the South China Sea, the area between the Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands. It was there that something of extraordinary power struck, melting the bedrock, forming mountains, and then raising an entire tectonic plate and leaving a temple in the ocean, a trail that leads directly to the island of Sumatra. Now let's return to the island of Sumatra and the Toba supervolcano. Something is not letting me rest. The thing is, the dating of this volcano's eruption was done according to the stratigraphic comparative method, invented in the middle of the century. The expedition consisted of a motley crew of a former soldier, Her Majesty, and a Catholic pastor, Impai Murchison and Adam Sejic, who for some reason everyone decided to call great geologists. I detailed it in my film, The Permian Extinction. In the year 2014, a reevaluation of the dating of the eruption was made using argon-argon dating, and the date was slightly shifted to 74,000 years ago. But the problem is that this method, like most others, is based on calibration using samples, whose date is known exactly, and known dates are set by relative dating, invented by Murchison and with Edgecombe. A vicious circle. So, summarizing all of the above, we see the following picture. First, the Angkor complex was built no earlier than 300 years ago, simply because it was not buried. Despite many claiming that it was excavated, this statement is completely illogical. Because there are drawings of the complex from the 19th century in which it already stands in all its glory. Right away, as soon as it was discovered. Where did the episodic leaks come from then? Yes, it's all very simple. The outer shell was made of sandstone. It's as strong as armor on the outside. But once this cork is removed, the soft interior is exposed. And the wild vibration caused by the fall of the asteroid and the subsequent rise of the tide, over several hours, simply ground the softest parts into a sandy powder, which then seeped into the structure and after years cemented again. This is very clearly seen, for example, in the Chrome Temple, the very one that tourists for some reason do not like to visit. For the same reason, the blocks scattered in different directions. Due to the absence of real polygonation, they simply fell apart. Secondly, someone says that Angkor was only destroyed in the 14th century, but it stood much earlier. This assertion also contradicts logic, as an unarmed eye can see the unfinished work, and the higher you climb the level of construction, the more clearly you can see the accumulation of stone blanks. They were installed but not processed, only prepared for processing. The third works were carried out using unknown devices, machines, technologies that are not yet available to us. And this machine was not the only one. There were several, 4 of them. Nevertheless, the work was carried out by ordinary, low-skilled people, led by a well-trained engineer, but still an ordinary person, most likely someone from a European school. 5. The stones for the temple were mined right here, in the excavation zone, which is now called the Eastern and Western Barai. It's very likely that they were simply extracted from more ancient buried walls and structures. The fact that the blocks were extracted from somewhere in a ready-made form and then adjusted on the spot is clearly visible almost everywhere. But the best example, in my opinion, is the remains of a bridge over the silted-up channel of the Siem Reap River. Parts of the supports of this bridge are clearly made of blocks extracted from somewhere, but after all, the canal was made specifically for the construction of Angkor. Where did they get these blocks from then? In my opinion, only from more ancient ruins. Truly ancient ones, hidden underground. 6. The work was abandoned abruptly. The workers just scattered in fear, leaving the most valuable equipment. And importantly, people didn't return there for several decades. This clearly shows a section of the wall with unfinished construction on the left. A characteristic selection of breeds with a diamond-shaped work zone is visible. But if you add a snapshot of contrast, you can see that there is also a diamond-shaped imprint on the right side. But it was not the result of work, but the result of the fact that the device was most likely simply thrown away. He leaned against the wall and stood in that position for many years. Over these years, the outer parts of the wall managed to get covered with moss and sunburn, and the part that was pressed by the mechanism retained its original yellowish tint to this day. It turned out to be something like a photograph of the mechanism's contour. Thanks to this contour, I was able to recreate the approximate appearance of the working part of the mechanism. However, it lacks something, for example, a pump that removes dust from the breed, and a gyroscopic support that allows precise work. Plus, it certainly had more delicate lasers on mobile manipulators for more precise work. Add to this the image of an operator sitting at the control panel and find 10 differences from Garuda, who settled Naga. Yes, that's exactly what the famous Nagas look like. These are working mechanisms, performing construction out of stone. By the way, if we assume that they had an autonomous function, then a fallen mechanism could fully scan any person who carelessly approached it, followed by its destruction and reproduction of the model in the nearest stone. Here you have Medusa Gorgon, whose head had to be cut off, that is, the working part. By the way, after being cut off, it still worked, which again speaks of a mechanism. 7. The destruction of the temple shows characteristic zones of movement, interfering with the seismic wave. 8. The zone of proposed culprits for the destruction includes the Toba, Tambora, Krakatoa volcanoes, and several smaller ones. Surprisingly, it coincides with the descriptions of the trajectory of movement and fall of one of the asteroids, which I talked about in the film Chronicle of a Diving Asteroid. This asteroid destroyed and shattered all of Indonesia and eventually went into the Earth's crust in the Banda Sea, leaving behind a trail similar to the one that separates South America from Antarctica. But most of all, of course, it fits the Toba volcano and the asteroid that caused it. And all the cosmic data indicate that it was indeed him. Naituru. After the fall of this asteroid, all of Indonesia became lifeless. Papuans appeared on it, most likely quite recently, which actually proves the surrounding locality. To the right of its fall is the lifeless desert of Australia for thousands of kilometers. And to the left is the devastated and most likely also previously lifeless Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and so on. From the water-mud tsunami most likely, only those who were slightly behind the movement of this asteroid were saved. Plus the island of Kalimantan, which most likely swallowed up the lion's share of the wave's energy and perhaps formed as a result of it. Next, following the movement, the island of Papua New Guinea is completely and entirely covered with nanoparticles, among which, by the way, you can sometimes notice outstanding megastructures. But about this some other time. 10. The Paris Colonial Exhibition in 1931 demonstrated a few things. First of all, the possibility of construction, the possibility of building one of the complexes in just 6 years using the usual technologies and cement mixture of that time, that is, by casting. Secondly, Britain, that is, the greatest colonial power at that moment, did not appear at the colonial exhibition. This is very much like some kind of covert struggle, a dispute between two giants, where one tells the other, "Look, this beauty is now mine," and the other in response ignores the exhibition. Well, that's how it is. And here, finally, it's worth saying a few words about the evidence presented by Yuri Abarin. He insists that Henri Mouhot was under British patronage. Britain sponsored him and provided money, resources, materials, and even a mini-army for this journey. Perhaps he was the main or one of the main architects of this complex. But after 1,874 years, when he had already died, the government in Cambodia changed and colonial power passed to the French. Anything is possible, but the sources Yuri personally refers to do not inspire much confidence in me. Firstly, because it's very similar to the fact that Henri himself possibly never existed. Too little is known about him, and what is known is somehow too unbelievable. He was born, got married, went to Cambodia, and died there. And all of that in 35 years. Moreover, he was so brilliant from birth that he began teaching French and Greek at the Russian Military Academy in St. Petersburg at the age of 18. But you understand, right? Look at your own children who are just finishing school at 18, and this one was already teaching 2 languages. Moving on to the third. Secondly, Yuri Abarin said several times in his video that the anchor was made of known materials. Where did he get this information? I don't even understand where his builders took him from. if he's not there. Nevertheless, the interest of the English and the French in this place clearly had a reason to be, and most likely the complex was built earlier, right in the 815 year. And Henri Mouhot himself is a more recent invention, part of the legend. Another point is the trees. Yuri Baron asserts that it was they who destroyed the complex with their roots. In this, by the way, Maxim Gaubitz agrees with him. Of course, some destruction by vegetation is quite possible, but not to the same extent and not everywhere. For example, inside some upper towers, there is a noticeable displacement. The bearing columns under the floor are very strongly displaced, and it cannot be a consequence of the development of the root system of trees. This could have happened precisely from a strong seismic impact on the complex from below. In general, if such a character as Henri Mouhot really existed, then his mission could consist in finding and taking the surviving equipment after the catastrophe and possibly trying to build a complex. This could also be the second explanation for the black soot, as the simplest way to get rid of huge trees is to simply burn them. So what turns out that there are no mysteries and miracles. Angkor was built in the year 815, and there is no great antiquity. Of course there is. First of all, the equipment with which this complex was built remains a mystery. And maybe he's not the only one. These machines are clearly not from our civilization. Where could they have come from to fall into the hands of the English or Europeans? And in large quantities too? And the second mystery is what motivated the construction of such temples specifically in that place? Why? Perhaps there is some unknown plan to us in this. Perhaps in Angkor there are indeed ancient structures, but they are not on the ground, but buried underground. Their remains still look from the bottom of Angkor's pools and Angkor itself as if to seal them from above, so that no one could conduct real archaeological excavations. And possibly such places around the world are not unique. There is a certain plan to hide such places, in plain sight, but about this in other series.